just either the slightly different from what they are, or we thought we see names are.
Welcome to Strange Familiars. Merry Christmas, Allison.
Oh, thanks, Tim. Merry Christmas to you.
And happy whatever winter holidays you celebrate to everyone who listens. Tonight, I will be talking with Brother Richard, our annual Christmas episode. We're going to be talking about St. Christopher and the cynocephalic, the dog-headed saints. People often ask me to do a show on it, both on the Flower Path and on Strange Familiars, because St. Christopher is often pictured with a dog's head. And of course, people immediately think
Egyptian? Oh, in your world, they think dogman.
Yeah, they think Daniel Cocker Spaniel.
Yeah.
Which is my new name for dogman, Daniel Cocker Spaniel. But, there's some other possible origins to it. We talk about that. We talk about werewolves, St. Natalis and St. Patrick and their werewolf stories. Talk about the woodwose, and talk about the balance of sort of the wild man and the quote-unquote civilized man, and how we need to make that balance. Brother Richard brought to us another fantastic set of research, and I want to thank him for doing that. Thank him for being part of Strange Familiars and for doing a Christmas show with me every year. I look forward to it every year.
This has got to be like the 6th year?
Oh,
Fifth year, yeah.
I'd have to go back and look at it.
I think it was 2019 that you first started chatting.
Wow.
Pre-pandemic.
Wow. Time flies when you do a podcast. Hey, you can give Strange Familiars as a gift. There's an option at Patreon to give gift subscriptions. I'll put a link up to that in the show notes as well. And in case anybody wants to do a last-minute gift for somebody, you can give them the gift of Strange Familiars. Helps us out, and they get some cool content besides. All right, let's go ahead and get to my talk with Brother Richard. Brother Richard, welcome back to Strange Familiars.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me once again. I'm sure any day now the boredom level is going to rise and I will be cast into exile like one of your hermits. So I'm happy to be here at the moment.
Then I'll write another book on you. So. Well, Merry Christmas.
And Merry Christmas to you, and indeed to all of the listeners.
So for our Christmas show, we're kind of concentrating on wild men. Mm-hmm. We have some saints and so forth that were associated with wild men, and some associated angles to look at here. Lots of things to cover. I'm super excited about it. Where do you want to start?
Maybe let's start at the beginning, and we can kind of circle in our journey if that's okay.
Sure.
So one of the really interesting things that has kind of grabbed me as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and then kind of wild man have been recounted. All of the stories that you've recounted across Strange Familiars has been this trend, which you noticed, which was the gradual wilding of these figures.
Yeah.
So, okay, we have the archetypal wild man, wild woman. It's always been there. The archetype of whether that's the civilized human who goes wild, or the creature of the wild that makes itself known to the civilized or the semi-civilized or whatever. And so if you look at it from an archetypal point of view, if you take the path of Jung or even Freud, there is this sort of idea that, we are the wild men and the wild women, that there's an element within us that's being projected in some way, at least archetypally in literature, in myth, in story, etc. Now, obviously, we would go further and say that people are actually encountering real things, and where we place those on the whole matter versus spirit, or the matter-spirit continuum, shall we say, is really interesting. But I was fascinated, and I've been thinking a lot, probably taking up too much time thinking, to be honest, about the this whole idea of as we get tamer, they get wilder.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think if we start maybe with the early ones and talk about, let's go back as far as the early saints and how they encountered it, because naturally, as has often been said on Strange Familiars, if you take the channel, the idea that these things are using the same channels to manifest, then we get the opposite ends of the continuum with, the saint who is seen as integrated, holistic, whole and holy. And I don't just mean the Christian saint now, I mean across, the holy person across all traditions. And then you have at the opposite end, the wild person, who is more sort of animalistic, savage, the idea of being dangerous, etc. And then you have this really strange confluence of both figures, which is the saint who is wild, the holy person who is wild. And you also have the sort of the tame wild man, the kind of encounter with, Bigfoot as brother, or Bigfoot as guardian, or Bigfoot as land guardian, etc. So it is circular. It's a cyclical continuum as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to try and move through some of these things without hopefully confusing either myself or you or the people out there too much. But these are more kind of just thoughts that have appeared along the way. So I hope that's okay.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, let's start way back. We can go back to Old Testament times, and we have this extraordinary moment in the life of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, a name that casts fear wherever it has to be read aloud in church because of its extraordinary spelling. I've seen many people stumble and fall over this, including one of our brothers who just gave up and decided to call him Pat all the way through.
That's great.
He said he might as well be Pat. Nobody else knows what I'm reading, so there we go. So Nebuchadnezzar has this extraordinary moment where, at the moment of his great exaltation of pride, and particularly after the conquering of the temple in Jerusalem and the sacrilege against the holy vessels and the articles of devotion there, we're told in the book of Daniel that his punishment is the Lord changes his heart, meaning obviously the center of his personhood, which is what heart meant in those days, his heart from the heart of a man to the heart of a wild beast. He grows hair, he grows talons, he begins to walk on all fours, he loses the power of speech, and he becomes wild and savage. And this is, as far as we know, one of the earliest ideas of somebody becoming bestial, where it's actually written down. I'm sure there are much earlier myths and stories. And, if we look at the kind of shamanic indigenous histories and traditions, you have everything from the idea of possession by the spirits that renders somebody wild, but also puts them in contact with the divine, with the gods, with the transcendent. But this is the first written account, as far as we know. We're probably looking at something that's been handed down from somewhere around 3000 to 2000 BC. It may also have influenced, through kind of cultural appropriation, cultural transfer, the story of Lycon in Greece, who is a king who falls under the wrath of Zeus. And this is the name that gives us lycanthropy, which is the werewolf end of things. So whether Lycon influenced the story of Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadnezzar influenced the story of Lycon, they both appear round about roughly the same time. And we know that there was great travel and congruence from the Mediterranean to the Middle East at that time. So quite possible that as stories were told, they were adapted into various cultures.
That's one of the things as I didn't get a great history education. I kind of had to educate myself a good bit. And luckily I have friends who were better educated and helped me along with that. But one of the things that occurred to me, as an adult, I think, I didn't realize this as a kid. I had this impression of the old world being very separate. But there was a lot more travel and interchange than I
absolutely.
think we knew. Yeah.
Absolutely. It took them longer, and people made much longer journeys. But when you have reasonably stable various sort of empires, now the empires shift and change along the way, but during times of stability, people travel. People do what they did today, which is they go and seek story or adventure, or, they want to run away and change their life or whatever it might be. So when you have, particularly during the Roman times, when you have this very stable network of, a civil service and a kind of a public road system through most of Europe into the Mediterranean down into the Middle East, into Africa, people traveled and traveled a lot. And even in terms of the Middle Ages, it was not beyond the bounds of possibility for someone who was, reasonably okay from a wealth point of view to make in their lifetime a journey to Jerusalem, a journey to Santiago de Compostela. We have a story of St. Anthony who imposes upon one man the penance, which is an incredible penance even now to think about. He was a murderer, and the penance he imposes on him is that he has to visit the tombs of all 12 apostles.
Oh, wow.
Which are, exactly, scattered all over the known world at the time. And he achieves it and then dies. And I'm sure it was died of exhaustion, really, at the end of it all. But what's interesting around it is that the world was so stable at that time that you could actually travel to visit the tombs of the 12 apostles. You would be hard pushed to do that now in terms of how unstable the world is now, So, we have this idea of everything being separate, but there was much more sharing of ideas, knowledge, story. And because the culture was much more of an oral culture and people's memories were far better than they are now, when you think of the amount of literature that was remembered by the average educated person, people could go and share these stories and songs and learn them along the way. And if you're walking for a long period of time, what do people do? They tell stories to each other as they go.
Mm-hmm.
And you also had the advantage of first Greek and second Latin, as time went on, being languages that the educated of all of the countries spoke at the same time. So it meant that wherever you went, you could have a conversation. And that is something that we have forgotten about today.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a lingua franca in English, I suppose, in a lot of the world today. But even still, it's not as present as we might think. So getting back to good old Nebuchadnezzar, he is put under this punishment. And until he humbles himself, he cannot return to civil society. And there were all kinds of discussions in the early days. Was this possession? Was it full-on werewolf? The curse of the werewolf? Was it a psychological illness or episode that he went through? And, the answer to that is obviously we'll probably never know. But certainly when the description is he didn't just act like a beast, he became bestial in that, he grew hair all over his body and his claws, his nails and teeth became, claws and fangs. Now, whether that's just exaggeration for the sake of a good story, who knows? But it certainly set the idea in motion. Remember, this is a story that would have been read in church. Everybody would have known this story quite well. It would have been often referred to in sort of medieval mystery plays and things like that as, pride and lust make us bestial, and literally in the case of Nebuchadnezzar. So you have this idea that evil actions, evil thoughts, etc., result in the human being falling from its exalted place as a creature of reason to becoming a savage, and I mean savage in the sense of the behavior, not the idea of, indigenous people or in any kind of colonial way. So from that point of view, we have this constant balancing of sort of three factors, which is the human being as the point where, the highest point of creation because of reason, and will, and the idea of the illumined intellect, but fallen. So you have this idea then, it's possible for our appetites to overcome us and for us to act in a bestial way. And then you have on either side of that, the angelic realm drawing us up, ever more enlightened, and the demonic realm drawing us down. Now, what does the demonic realm want to do as far as the early fathers and mothers of the church were concerned? It wants to make the human being as a creature of reason a fool. And the way that it makes it a fool is particularly through temptation, through the animal passions. And then if we fall into that, the worst possible moment of that would be to be possessed in such a way that we lose our reason and become animalistic. So there is the fear of the wild man and the wild woman as such, as being creatures who in some way are under a ban or under a curse. That's the first kind of movement of it. The second, though, is this idea that the saint or the holy person can live in the wild and can even let go of the marks of civilization and live more in union with nature. And this is a kind of an Adamic existence where the saint or the monastic particularly goes into the wild. And so it tames the wild, and where they're living in harmony with the wild. So we see this again starting in the Old Testament with the prophet Elijah, who is sort of a wild man by adoption in the sense that he wears camel skin. His hair and his beard grow. He's depicted as a sort of a wild figure out in the desert. He goes to the mountains where he is fed by the ravens, and there's an implication, that whole ancient idea of, that the holy person, or the person who has taken on the god madness, or the vocation of prophecy, or whatever you want to call it, receives the gift of the language of the birds, this sort of mystical language of nature, this pre-Adamic language of nature. So there he is, being fed by the ravens, being looked after them, full of power over the elements, etc. He can stop rain from falling, he can call down fire from heaven, etc. And he becomes actually the original archetype for monastic life. To this day, the Carmelite order, which are the oldest monastic order in the Western Church, and coming from Mount Carmel, which was where Elijah had his hermitage, they see themselves as the spiritual sons and daughters of the prophet Elijah. So they trace their monastic tradition right the way back to the early Desert Fathers, and through the Desert Fathers back into the Old Testament. Because the tradition is that Elijah set up a brotherhood of prophets on Mount Carmel, and their job was to pray for the coming of the Messiah. And one of the earliest apparitions of Our Lady is supposed to have been to the early hermits on Mount Carmel, and that it was Our Lady who converted them to the faith. Now that's in the realm of, ancient foundation legend as such. Yeah. But certainly the Carmelites would look to that as a kind of a spiritual inspiration story for their charism. And that runs us through all the prophets and the wildness of the prophets, Elijah, Elisha, etc., right the way through then to John the Baptist in the New Testament, who Christ refers to him as the Elijah who was to come, because Elijah was prophesied as that he would come 2 more times, once before the coming of the Christ, and secondly, at the end of the world, he would come to announce the coming of Christ at the end of time. So in this instance, the spirit of Elijah is given to John the Baptist, and he does exactly the same. He's driven by the Holy Spirit out into the wild. Again, he becomes this extraordinary wild figure living on wild honey and locusts and covered in camel skin. Again, if ever you see any icon of John, I'm looking at one here now, actually at my desk, you'll see that he's given a very unkempt, wild look, long hair all over from his head to his feet, that kind of idea. And then this is further then moved in, if we stick to the apostolic age, with the idea of Mary Magdalene, whom we've talked about many, many times already. But the idea, again, that the contemplative, the person of great love and prayer, enters into this theotic relationship with God where they are transformed as such. And so they become wild, but in the understanding of the holiness of the wild. And if we pause that for a moment, we also have this in the gospel, in that Christ goes into the desert and into the Garden of Gethsemane, at both ends of his public ministry. And these are seen again as the Christ redeeming the wild, as well as, just speaking to people. And there's this beautiful phrase in the Gospels that says, after he has conquered the temptations of the demons in the desert, it says, he was with the wild beasts and the angels came and ministered to him. And it's a throwaway line, but there is no such thing as a throwaway line really in the scriptures. And what we're talking about is he has revealed himself to be the new Adam. He is the one who can cast down the demons. He's the one who can name the beasts, and they are with him. And he is the one to whom the angels minister, which was the original understanding of what the Adamic human would have been like, So there's this tension that we see all the way through. And this goes further then, and stop me along the way at any stage if I'm boring you or going too far or anything else. But what we see then with the desert fathers and mothers, who are the earliest of the monastics, is this idea that it's actually the job of the monastic to go into the wild and there to face the savagery of their own animal appetites and to overcome that through grace. So there's the understanding that the monk must know him, or the nun for that matter, but they would say the monk must know himself at one and the same time to be the sanctified human, the temple of the Holy Spirit, the person who is, redeemed through by Christ, and to recognize within himself the savagery of hell, the savagery of the demons, the wildness of the appetites if they were to be given over. One of the monastic fathers puts it beautifully. He says the monk must always keep his heart in heaven and his mind in hell. In other words, to know the possibilities that are inherent in every moment and to choose rightly, not to pretend that you're something you're not. And so you have this extraordinary revelation of this with the moment when, we've mentioned this before, when St. Anthony, who is considered the father of monastic life within the Christian tradition, goes into the desert and has, as part of his encounter, yes, he overcomes the demons and he overcomes his own thoughts and he overcomes his own appetites, etc., all through grace. And he comes back as the kind of theotic person, the holy person. But on his way, called out of the desert to preach the good news, he encounters two different beings. And this is recorded in his legenda, in his life to this day. The first he encounters is a centaur. And he's totally taken aback to see a centaur standing in the desert waiting for him. So he does what all good monks do, which is he makes the sign of the cross. And the centaur disappears immediately. And he realizes, okay, this is just a deception of the enemy trying to distract him from his mission. So he goes on. But then he meets what is variously translated as either a satyr, a faun, or a wild man. And the description that's given is more faun-like. It talks about a short person, a little man who is, his bottom half is like a beast, the kind of goatee end of things. Mm-hmm. And he makes the sign of the cross thinking, here's another demon to dismiss. But the creature goes nowhere. And he goes up further and he realizes this is a physical being, or at least appearing as a physical being. And there's this wonderful conversation that takes place between them where he realizes, oh, this is a being of reason. And they have a conversation where the little creature says, look, we live in the wild. The wild has been given to us, just as the cities have been given to men. And unfortunately, people, when they see us, are either frightened of us or they bow down and worship thinking we're gods. But we're not gods. We're just other kinds of creatures. And they have this quite philosophical debate, really, or conversation along the way. And they're invited. The little creature departs asking Anthony to pray for him. And you have this lovely moment of Anthony blessing the faun, which is often depicted in iconography. And that's seen in a number of ways. You can see it as maybe a kind of a Christian parable or a Christian tale, sort of saying, well, the monastic tradition has now tamed the wild and even the pagan deities are sort of bowing down. But the early monastics didn't see it that way at all. They saw it as a clear description of, there are other things. There are other rational creatures. There are the creatures of the wild. And human beings have been given the village, the town, the civilized place. And these other creatures are creatures under God and loved by him, but they've been given the wild. And so if you go into the wild, you're likely to encounter them. And to differentiate between the apparitions of spirits that are there just to distract or to cause fear or amazement or whatever, and these other creatures who just live there. So you have this beginning of a kind of a categorization of the other as having various different manifestations along the way, and this idea that they're just the people of the wild, And I remember I was telling somebody else this recently. One of our oldest brothers taught me a beautiful prayer to pray whenever I was traveling, which was to wish peace upon any being I meet along the way, whether seen or unseen, any being that I pass by, through, or around. And I think it's a beautiful kind of prayer to have, because it's the acknowledgement that I could be passing, an infinite number of creatures that I don't have the sensory awareness to see, and not wanting to offend or whatever, I wish them blessing before I leave, And this was the idea that the monastics who became wild men, who went into the desert and who shed all forms of civilization, including clothing quite often, they were to become as wild as possible, to approach this Adamic union with God. And this really reached its acme in the deserts with two particular groups of people. The Boskai, or grazers, these were monks who lived entirely as hermits and ran around on all fours, lived naked, allowed the hair of the head and the hair of the beard to grow, engaged solely in silent contemplation, and lived on whatever vegetation they could find along the way. They were rare, as you can imagine, but they were not considered mad. They were considered having been taken by holy madness, which was the idea later resurfaces in monastic life as the kind of the holy fool, the person who can turn all the conventions of society upside down, but who teaches in that way. And to this day, in the Orthodox tradition, particularly Russian Orthodoxy, there are men and women who are seen as holy fools and who are recognized as mad, definitively mad, with mental problems and issues, but through whom God speaks, and who have great wisdom and who have to be protected by the society or the village or the town because the divine speaks through them and even through their seeming madness.
This is mirrored, I think, in the Hindu tradition with I believe the sadhus. They kind of live separate. They're very,
absolutely,
very kind of wild. Their practices may seem extreme to us, but they're seen as very holy people.
Yeah, 100%. And so we see this again and again, which is this idea that let's call it the holy madness, this idea for divine union, whether it's whatever tradition it's in, we'll send someone out into the wild because it's only out there away from all of the distractions, the labels, the names, the restrictions of society that allows someone to actually enter fully into this sort of divine awareness. And
didn't Jesus instruct us to go pray in the wild?
Absolutely. And this is what he did himself, all the way through the Gospels. And we have that constant example of what does he do? He goes off and finds a lonely place, a place apart, a place in the wild. He spends the greater part of the night in prayer. He goes to the mountains. He goes away. Quite often the disciples wake up in the morning and he's just gone, and they have to go and search for him and find him again, because he's gone off to spend time with his Father. And I think this is again and again what we're called to as well as human beings. I think in the midst of the chaos of the city and the kind of using the city as archetype now, the sort of the chaos of civilization, the crushing weight of presence, of human presence that we all experience, whether it's online, it's in the midst of our day-to-day existence, that, to actually be able to get out into the wild, to breathe air, we know all the advantages that people talk about now, like forest bathing and moving into, even just having a wide vista actually lowers blood pressure and calms the brain and the mind. So there's this invitation to recognize that the wild is something that the civilized creature actually needs and is drawn towards, but at the same time recognizing that we are in somebody else's territory when we do that. And there's a kind of a code of behavior expected in the midst of it all. And that went so far as it, as I mentioned, the grazers, the monks who ran around on all fours. And we also had the dendrites, who were monks who decided that they would live in trees to be as near to heaven as possible, as near to the birds. Eventually they became the stylites, who were the monks who lived on pillars. And people often have this idea, because they've seen it in iconography, that there's some poor monk balanced on a pillar that's about 6 inches wide, at the top of a tower. And that wasn't what the pillars looked like. They were quite wide, there was a shelter on them, etc. But again, it was this idea of withdrawing, going to a liminal space, being between earth and heaven, in the middle of the wild, so as to receive this along the way, to receive graces. Yeah.
Would the dendrites and the grazers, would these have been in the Middle East?
Yeah, deserts of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, sadly, places that are very much in the news now at the moment. And again, because our historical perspective often shifts, we forget that this was actually, where the kind of monastic tradition in the West began, within the deserts of these places. And also, I wouldn't be Irish if I didn't claim some of it, at least. It also, there was a huge, huge movement and wave that also influenced the islands of Ireland and even out as far as the Icelandic coast. And that's where we get another wild man account that turns up, which is good old St. Brendan, the navigator, supposedly one of the discoverers of the Americas, perhaps. But Brendan practiced this extraordinary practice called peregrinatio pro Christi, which was to journey for Christ. And so what they would do, these wonderful monks, was they would get into their boat with a small little group of monks and some provisions, and they would row out to where the tides could take them, and then they would throw the oars overboard.
Oh.
And simply say, let the winds take us where they will. So Brendan was from a people down on the coast of Kerry, which is right on the sort of southwest coast of Ireland. Very wild seas, right out at the Atlantic edge. So they were looking out at the edge of the world. I mean, people already thought Ireland was the edge of the world to some extent. You know, there was nothing beyond Ireland except possibly this mythical island of Hy Brasil, where all kinds of mythical creatures lived. So it was considered a dangerous sea to go out across. But for whatever reason, and there's all kinds of theories that perhaps there may have been knowledge handed down even from pre-Christian times, that there may have been knowledge that there is something out there. But he and a group of monks undertook this extraordinary journey, which is recorded as the Navigatio. It's a very famous early medieval manuscript, and it gives the pilgrimage, the peregrination of Brendan and the various encounters on islands that he connected along the way. But one of the islands he connects with is an island of hairy men. And they didn't seem to have the power of speech, and they were quite, aggressive, but the monks did their best to sort of trade with them and preach to them, etc. And eventually they left them. They left them there. Now, there's all kinds of theories from they met the Inuit, perhaps. They met possibly people who were dressed in bear skins or wolf skins or whatever, that the fact that they couldn't understand them may mean that they'd actually hit maybe the edge of Iceland, and Icelandic languages wouldn't be very understandable to the Celts. So there's all of these possibilities, but it's recorded as they met wild men, and they were not surprised to meet wild men, because the understanding was that this is where, once you go out into the wild, once you go to the edge of the world, you're going to meet all of these various kind of mythical creatures again, And so you have this extraordinary current that continues right the way down. So you've got like St. Christopher, the famous story of St. Christopher, who's supposed to have come from one of those tribes, the people who were known as the dog-headed, the cynocephalic. And so often in his iconography, he's pictured as having a dog head.
Mm-hmm.
And they say this may have been a mistranslation of the tribe that he came from, the Marmarite. They did live at the edges of the Roman Empire. They were people who were quite big. And it may have been that people misread that as a kind of a pun, in fact, was being used, that they were wild, they were dog-headed. But there is a category of early saint, particularly still in the Byzantine tradition, known as the cynocephalic, saints whose official iconography shows them with dog heads. And usually they're stories of saints who had great physical strength, or were wild men who were converted, like Christopher was, or who fulfilled kind of these liminal functions like Christopher does as a patron of travelers and those who cross rivers, etc. So they become these kind of guardians. And there's a long, long ancient tradition going right the way back into the very early mists of time that, the image of the guardian is naturally the dog, and the one who is set at the boundaries, whether it's Cerberus, with the in front of the Greek underworld, or you have Fenris who brings about the great wolf dog who brings about the Ragnarok, the end of the world, etc. in the Norse understanding. So these saints, these guardians, were often given these images to depict attributes of their story or of their life, or maybe even where they came from. But the problem then becomes later, it's kind of considered almost, he actually had a dog's head.
Yes.
So,
I have to say, St. Christopher with the dog head is one of the most requested things, certainly for the Flowered Path, probably for Strange Familiars too. I get a lot of people who ask, like, you should do something on that. You should do something on that. So I was happy to see it in your list of topics, because people have been requesting it.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So the land that he came from, he was initially a pagan, and he was enslaved to a sorcerer. I'm sure you know the story well. And he decided that in his life he would serve the person he found who was most powerful. And so as a big guy, he became this bodyguard to a sorcerer. And then one day he saw the sorcerer bowing down, cowing in fear because the spirits that he was invoking were trying to attack him. So he had no time for the sorcerer after that. And he said, no, I'll serve the spirits themselves, take out the middleman kind of idea. So he begins to serve the spirits themselves. And then on one occasion, a Christian monk comes into the town and the spirits flee in terror. And he says, oh, well, I need to follow him. So he starts trying to follow him then. And the Christian monk says to him, no, you certainly don't bow down. You don't worship us. We worship Christ. And he explains Christ to him. And so Christopher says he wants to serve Christ, but how can he find him? So the monk sets him as a penance for his sins and for his violence, but also as an act of charity, that he would, because he was so big, that he would stand at a ford and he would assist people crossing the ford from then on, and that he wasn't to take money or charge people for it. So that's the idea of St. Christopher as the patron of travelers. And on one occasion, the story goes that as he wakes up one morning, constantly praying that he would meet the Christ who he would be able to serve. And he finds a little child at the side of the river, and the child says he has to cross the river to get to his father. So Christopher says, hop on my back. And the child says, you won't be able to carry me. And of course, Christopher laughs in his pride and he says, how heavy do you think you are? I've carried, huge burdens across the river. There's no problem. So the child gets on his back. And as he begins to cross the river, the child gets heavier and heavier and heavier until Christopher is almost drowning. And at that point, he cries out for help, and the child helps him get to the other side. And so Christopher says, who are you? And he said, I'm the one you're looking for. I'm the Christ. He said, but how can you possibly be so heavy? And he said, because I carry the sins of the world. Mm. And so at that stage, Christopher repents completely and is totally forgiven. And the Christ gives him the blessing of being the one who protects travelers, because he's the only one who has actually carried the Christ who carries the world. It's a beautiful, beautiful legenda.
Oh, yeah.
And it has led to the great understanding of Christopher and eventually Christopher gives his blood. He becomes a martyr because he chooses to stand for Christ, but not to use his great strength to sort of attack those who are attacking him. And he gives himself up as a martyr. And one of the things that's really important, if we can just fix this, I'm going to fix this now publicly, is he was never demoted as a saint. Okay.
I've heard people say this. Yeah.
Possibly this idea of, the Catholic Church, they threw out all these saints. They did not. What happened was, after the Second Vatican Council, because there had been a huge number of new saints, and they wanted to make sure they also received their feast days and their due, a lot of the early saints were gathered together and were given one feast day instead of all of them occupying all of the space on the calendar. So Christopher, Philomena, all of these various saints are now venerated under one title, which is the early martyrs of Rome. And we venerate all of them to this day, but we still invoke them in the litanies. We still pray to them. Christopher is listed as one of the famous 14 holy helpers that all the medievals would have venerated. And, we still have churches dedicated to him. And there's even relics of Christopher in various places in both East and West. So I think it's very important just to get, it wasn't that was kind of misreported. And of course, it made good media at the time, all these saints are no longer saints. And it's absolutely not true.
So I've certainly seen more icons of him with a human head than a dog head.
In the West, yes. Yeah. But if you go to our Byzantine brothers and sisters, to the Orthodox churches, etc., and especially to the Coptic church, you will only see him with a dog head.
Oh, okay.
To this day. And so, he's literally the hound of heaven in that sense. And then you also have, if we bring it a little further in history, you have a lot of the Celts were kind of very obsessed with werewolves, and are to this day, I would say. But you have this extraordinary story that St. Patrick himself once punished the Welsh king Veretricius by transforming him into a wolf. And so this is because while Patrick was in Ireland, he became so disgusted with the wickedness of certain tribes that would howl like wolves. These may have been the kind of berserker warriors that were around, because when he tried to preach Christianity to them, they would start howling and screaming. So he cursed them and condemned them to become werewolves. This is legend, obviously. But the spell fell on the tribesmen, caused them to turn into werewolves once every 7 years. They could stay in wolf form for 7 years, then once that had passed, they were to come back into humans, but then for another 7 years, and then back into the wolf until they died. The only thing was, which is really interesting, even as werewolves, they were not to be denied the sacraments of the church, according to Patrick. So again, we have this archetypal idea of the wild receiving grace, that the human being is still in there in somewhere. So they were still to receive the sacraments, and you have these stories of the werewolves turning up every Sunday to sit outside the churches for Mass, etc. And then Gerald of Wales, about 1191, Geraldus Cambrensis is one of the most extraordinary stories of historians of Ireland. He records the testimony of a priest who swore that he once gave Holy Communion to one of the werewolves. That the werewolf presented itself, turned into its human aspect, and asked for Holy Communion on a Sunday, and he gave it absolution, and it received Holy Communion, and then turned back into a wolf and it went away. Huh. There were so many stories of werewolves in Ireland that actually, up until the early 18th century, one of the names for Ireland was Wolfland.
Ah.
Yeah, you've all of these extraordinary stories. And to this day, actually, even though, the last Irish wolf was supposed to have been killed somewhere 1700s, maybe early 1700s, you have people who report wolves to this day, both spectral and real.
Strange Familiars is brought to you by our patrons. We could not make the show without them. I want to thank our patrons no matter where they're signed up. Thank you so much. It's a huge help. If you like Strange Familiars and you'd like to help us to make the show and get extra content besides, you can become a patron at Patreon. It's patreon.com/strangefamiliars. All of our patrons get commercial-free versions of the weekly shows, plus extra episodes every month. We do at least one. Sometimes we do more. Again, it's patreon.com/strangefamiliars. We also have a program at Apple Podcasts. It's called Patron of the Strange there. And Apple Podcast subscribers get the commercial-free weekly shows and the bonus shows monthly as well.
And then you have your favorite story, I think, in all of this, which is Saint Natalis, the abbot. Very sort of lesser known saint. He traveled from Ulster to Meath. He was on a mission and he had an acolyte who was helping him. And as they lie down to sleep one night in the woods on their way for this pilgrimage journey, he hears a human voice calling from the forest, gets up, looks out into the darkness and sees a giant wolf drawing near. So the two of them are terrified, naturally. And then even more so when the wolf begins to speak in a human voice and says to them, we're natives of Ossory, that's a place in the Midlands of Ireland. From there, every 7 years, because of the imprecation of a certain saint, namely the abbot Natalis, this man and woman are compelled to go into exile, not only from their territory, but also from their bodily shape. And the priest asks, how did you come by this fearsome form? Why must you wear it for 7 years? And the answer then is, I'm a member of the clan Attila, tribe of this region. And like yourself, Father, we are believers in Jesus Christ and the power of his salvation. I'm quoting the legend directly now, the English translation of it. However, in times long past, we were cursed for some ancient sin by the blessed abbot Natalis. The priest had heard of Natalis, who had come to Ireland shortly after the blessed Patrick to help him in bringing the gospel to the land. He had even read some of the holy man's works. From what he had read, he had always imagined Natalis to be exceedingly severe and inflexible in his teachings, unlike Patrick, and one who would brook no deviation from any of his own interpretations of God's law. He sounds a very nice man to meet. Anyway, the sin which, and I love this, the wolf says, the sin which my clan committed, we have even long forgotten. But the curse is still in force, so they don't even know why they're turning into wolves anymore. Every 7 years, two of us must lose our mortal form to wear the skin of a wild wolf, and we must live in the deep woods away from the clan. When the 7 years are up, we shed our animal form and regain our human shape, and two others must take our place. It's a terrible burden, Father, and one that will never be lifted because Natalis died before he could lift the curse. The wolf asks the priest to accompany him into the woods to give the last rites to his mate, the female wolf. The priest is filled with terror that the wolf will kill him, but he follows the wolf into the woods. He gives the dying wolf Holy Communion and blesses her. The male wolf returns the priest to his campfire and bids him farewell, loping back into the forest. The priest calls out after him saying he would come back on his way back. And on his way back from Ulster, he goes into the forest to try and find them, but never found them anymore. So there we go. It's quite a pathetic kind of legend in the sense that you have this extraordinary idea that they're doing penance for a sin that they have even forgotten what it was.
Yeah.
You know, that this constant descent into the bestial nature has taken away from them even the understanding that they have, you know. So on top of that, we then have lycanthropy and werewolfdom and people becoming wild men being seen in the Middle Ages as a medical disease. So if you'd like, I can read you the cure for lycanthropy,
Please.
Which comes from the 11th century. So here we go. This is the description of it and what happens. On lycanthropy, persons affected by lycanthropy go out at nighttime and wander among tombs and wild places. You can recognize them from the following signs. So we can all tick these off one by one to make sure we're not actually lycanthropes. They are pale with dry, dull, and hollow eyes, without tears. The tongue is extremely dry and without saliva. They are very thirsty, and their legs are covered with scars from frequent stumbling. You must know that lycanthropy is a type of overuse of the melancholic humour, and it must be treated by bloodletting until fainting, and offering an appropriate diet and baths with sweet water. They mean pure water. Purgation by the hyra of colocynth must be applied twice or 3 times, and then use the herb viper terracea and the other healing methods for melancholy. When the disease is approaching you, you must sedate the patient by the use of wet compresses and an administration of opium. And I'll be delighted to hear that. Opium always comes up in all the medical cures. Anyway, rubbing the ears and the nostrils with a somniferous method, in other words, applying the smell of sulfur. So I think it's really interesting. You have this sudden jump in the early Middle Ages to recognizing that there is the curse aspect to it, there's the spiritual aspect to it, but there's also this understanding that actually people can go wild, or in inverted commas, mad, in a bestial way that can come from essentially what they're talking about is a mental health breakdown.
Yeah.
And there are also a lot of the symptoms that they're talking about there are actually the symptoms of the onset of diabetes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So the ulcers on the legs, the dry tongue, losing tears, always thirsty, bad-tempered, etc. All of those kind of things can come from it. So it may actually be that one of the things they were talking about here was the idea, having a very holistic idea of medicine as they had in those days, this idea that there was a kind of a melancholic depression, which could have as its origin the sort of unclean thoughts idea, that it could be temptation towards despair. But they recognize that there are ways of healing and minding someone who's on the edges of lycanthropy. This is to try and prevent someone descending into it completely. So that comes from about the year, I think it's 1191. You have this gradation of wildness. You have the terror and fear of the human being losing the veneer of civilization. You have the understanding that out in the wild, there are the wild creatures themselves, these tribes of monsters who are to be recognized as fellow citizens of the world, but the wild belongs to them in a way that it doesn't belong to us. And then you have those who, through spiritual discipline in all of the traditions, go into the wild and even become wild for a while. You often refer to the story of Merlin, for example, becoming the wild man so as to learn wisdom, to learn knowledge. And this was, to my mind, I'm sure to many others, it sounds like almost a kind of a shamanic initiation of some description that he goes through. And we still have it to this day. You know, what do people do when they need wisdom or when they need a break or when they need, healing? They go out into the wild and then begin to encounter the things that we know that are there. And so I think when there's the expectation of meeting the monstrous, and I mean that in the best sense, out there, or encountering the monstrous within ourselves, but through spiritual discipline, arriving at a kind of a more balanced experience of it, or, a cure of it, or a disciplined use of it. What we find is that the wild and the domestic, shall we say, begin to work in a balanced way to bring about kind of healing. But when we're divorced from the wild, as so much of the West is now at this stage, it becomes a place of fear and terror and horror. And I think we get that back from the wild in return. So like the weekend hunter that you perhaps talk about, or others talk about, who goes out and sees the great beast in the woods and never goes back to the woods again. Whereas when you're in your latest episodes, when you're talking about, the people of Pine Ridge and how, he's around.
Yeah.
He's part of it. So are the little people. So are the spirits. Oh yeah, the UFOs fly by occasionally, but we live in an awareness of all of those. And we recognize that they're trying to tell us things. And sometimes we get the messages wrong, or sometimes it's, I think, I said to you, it really came across to me from the Pine Ridge episodes that the people there, saw him as a messenger of greater awareness.
Yes.
There's a moment, I think, where one of the people you're interviewing was like, no, he doesn't bring bad news and he doesn't bring good news. He just tells us to notice things, to be aware of things, that things are about to happen. So it's kind of a gift of knowledge, in the midst of that. But the more divorced we become from the wild, the more we project our fears into it. And if we're going to go with the whole co-creation theory that we speak of, then if we're going in, fearing the great animal beast that's going to attack us, then the likelihood is that's what we're going to meet. Either as a projection of our own psyche or as the clothes that the other will wear, because it thinks that's what we want. And we're back to, what color of Bigfoot did you see? At that point.
Yeah.
And that, to me, has led me to a little bit of a thought around the whole werewolf dogman end of things, which is that if we are saying that the more divorced from the wild we become, the wilder Bigfoot becomes in return, then perhaps we're now at the stage of Bigfoot actually transforming back into the big bad wolf. And so maybe it's not a case of Bigfoot versus Dogman, or Dogman being, a different species or anything like that. But what if Bigfoot is actually becoming the wolf again, becoming the darkest part of our psyche that was terrified of the wolf in the dark, the savage in the dark? And so instead of the kind of more intellectual, more like us ape or ape-like wild man, what we're now being faced with is, the wild actually saying, well, I need to be even more aggressive with them to wake them up. Yeah, so we have these very fearful encounters.
Yeah, I like that. That as much as one can know any of this stuff, there's a ring of truth to that, to me.
Well, it's just a thought. That's all. But it's funny. Josh had a post up today wondering if the explosion of the drones thing is the next stage of UFO development. Like the way you often say the UFOs always seem to be just ahead of where we are technologically. They keep transforming just ahead. And maybe Bigfoot goes just a little further back each time, And so it also struck me in the Pine Ridge approach, while he's, they speak of spirit. And I'm always wary of, when we translate terms from language to language, someone can hear somebody say, oh, it's a spirit, and they immediately think what they mean in the Western understanding is non-corporeal presence, ghost, etc. Whereas the older understanding of anything spirit was, it could be as physical 1 minute as it wants to be, and it could be as incorporeal 1 minute as it wants to be. It has the transformation of matter. And that was always the understanding of the Fae, for example, that they could conjure bodies for as long as they needed them and then just dissolve them back into the elements again whenever they wanted to. So when the people of Pine Ridge are saying, he's a spirit, but he's also a man, and he's the big man, and a different kind of man, and then you look at something like, say, the Olympic Project, etc., who are looking for a monkey in the woods, and what they get are manifestations of monkeys in the woods. But again, uncatchable apes, I should say. You do have this kind of idea that maybe if we were to approach the wild as some of these, holy people of all traditions have done, what we would find is that we would be met actually by something that is more open to dialogue, and we end up like good old Antony in counting the faun or the satyr and having the conversation with it and parting as, friends who respect each other's territories rather than being run out of the woods by the big beast with the glowing eyes.
The wise wild men of old.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, and again, that's back to the idea of, very early Middle Ages, the woodwose, which was the old idea of the wild man in Europe, especially in the kind of Germanic and English speaking. Where do we find those carvings, those pictures? We find them in churches. And they were used as images of not just the wild itself, but they were seen as figures that actually supported and defended people who went through the wild. And so the woodwose was traditionally placed in churches as the supporting figure of the baptismal font. They were usually around the base of baptismal fonts, just as the green men were around the kind of roof bosses holding them up. And while we can say, well, they're symbols from maybe pagan pasts or early pasts as well, actually, if you really look at the history, they don't really manifest in Europe till the early part of the Middle Ages. Where they come from, there's all kinds of debate and discussion over. But it certainly seems that at least within the understanding of the kind of more ancient monastic tradition within Europe, at least, there was this understanding that, the world is populated by all of these things and they can help us. And I particularly love the fact that, the myth of the green man in the very earliest records we have of it is that it's actually part of the legend of Seth, Adam's son, who is given the first seeds of the forest. He's a forester, so he's given the first seeds by Abel. Obviously, Abel is then killed by Cain, and Seth comes along afterwards, inherits these seeds, and wanting to kind of, become the forester and plant the forest, he decides that in tribute to his father Adam, who's now dead, he plants the seeds in the skull of Adam. And so the green man is supposed to be Adam's skull exploding with the forests of the world. And it explodes in the four directions because the forests spread all over the world, but it's also supposed to be an indication that Adam will eventually live again through the fruit of the forest, because the fruit of the forest eventually becomes the tree of the cross. So you have this beautiful weaving in of the wild itself, like nature itself, forest itself is meant to be a conduit through which everything comes back to original unity again.
Yeah. What's the origin of that story? I mean, as best as is known.
Oh, it goes back to early Byzantine legends. I have a source for it here. Because the green man, as kind of just being a symbol of the Western wild, really only comes about in the 1930s. There was a lady, Raglan, who was one of these self-appointed collectors of folklore, but who kind of imposed her own ideas on it. So yeah, it goes back to the 4th century. Late 4th century example of a green man disgorging the vegetation from his mouth is at Saint Abre in Saint-Hilaire-de-Grand, France. Also seen particularly in the churches of Jerusalem, foliate heads. And so the suggestion was, in a tentative way by historians, that the symbol may have originated in Asia Minor, been brought to Europe by traveling stone carvers, and then the green man slowly then was incorporated into the more ornate Christian churches as the cathedrals particularly were built across Europe. And so you have this beautiful thing. So the book is called, that it comes from The Green Man in Medieval England, A Christian Shoots from Pagan Roots, written in 2022. And the quote from it that I had was, yes, a Judaic-derived motif relating to the legends and medieval hagiographies that was known as the Quest of Seth. The 3 or 4 twig seeds or kernels that were planted below the tongue of the postfall Adam by his son Seth after he dies. These were given by the angel of mercy responsible for guarding Eden so that human beings could create the forests of the world. These shoot forth, bringing new life to humankind, and are seen as a prophecy of the cross.
That's amazing.
So,
that's an amazing story. I'd never heard that.
Yeah, there you go. So, you dig deeper and you dig deeper, and stuff begins to get deeper and deeper and more connected, more and more connected. And I think one of the difficulties with a lot of the kind of the sort of folkloric stuff that was done, particularly in England in the sort of early 1900s up to about 1950, 60, was that through no fault of their own, the folklorists who were kind of searching for folklore at that stage and trying to find the remnants of kind of pre-Reformation folklore as to where all of this stuff had come from, because so much of the iconography had been defaced or destroyed or records broken down in the Reformation, that they just simply didn't know the medieval connections for this, because Western Europe had been kind of cut off from the early roots, and especially while they may have had Latin, they wouldn't have had a lot of or access to the Greek texts. So again, there's an awful lot of kind of ressourcement that's going on at the moment as these scholars are beginning to find older and older records of these things.
It happened in folk song too. There was a lot of people made declarations about certain songs. You know, this is the origin of it, and then, you know, time would go on, and they would turn up in Appalachia. You know, an older version that people had carried with them, and suddenly they realize, oh, wait a second, you know.
Sure.
But it's taken some time, because once you put something down in a book, people tend to believe it.
Yeah, and once you put it on the internet,
yeah,
that's even worse.
Yeah,
there's so much out there. If you like, I can send you over some of these sources if you want to put them into notes for the episode. I'm happy to send various links and things like that to the bibliography or whatever. I can do that. To sort of finish on this thing of kind of the balance of the wild, I often talk about, I had the great grace of visiting Mount Athos in Greece it's about 15, 16 years ago now. Athos, for those who don't know it, there's a wonderful Netflix documentary on Mount Athos. So if anybody wants to have a look at that, you'll get the idea of it. But Mount Athos is essentially the monastic republic of Mount Athos. So it's the center of Byzantine monasticism in Europe. It's a kind of a peninsula just off the coast of Thessalonica in Greece. And it is, since very ancient times, just solely for monastic observance. Some of the monasteries there would have maybe 1,500, 1,600 years of continuous monastic observance. It's very difficult to get into, particularly if you're not Orthodox. And we were allowed in because we were monastics. The three of us went, and we spent 10 days journeying from monastery to monastery and staying with the monks there. But one of the things you do as you're traveling through, because it's a peninsula that's utterly beautiful. I mean, it's just stunningly beautiful. And you travel through kind of forest and up and down mountain to meet these monks and hermits along the way. Some of them still live in caves. Some of them live exactly as the early monastics did. And then there are also beautiful monasteries with magnificent libraries and churches, etc. But along the way, one of the things you're asked to do is you find these little forest altars. So they might have a little icon of Our Lady, and usually there's a vessel of water there for, you know, they're built near springs and things so pilgrims can fill up on water. But you're also supposed to leave a little offering of food there, because there is a legend of the 12 hidden monks of Mount Athos. And these are monastics whose contemplation has become so great that they have passed even beyond being hermits, and they live wild in the woods. And they've arrived at a point where they live such a spiritual existence that they only materialize occasionally. But you're called to leave food for them. And of course you do. And I'm sure the forest consumes the food, however it does that, whether it's through the monastics or whether it's through the wildlife or whether it's through fellow pilgrims coming in your footsteps who are hungry. But again, the idea is that you're recognizing that a high point of contemplative union is to arrive at union with the landscape, union with the earth, union with the wild, just as much as union with heaven. And we'd have that within our own Franciscan tradition as well. Obviously, you know, people know St. Francis and nature, but there is that idea that through his meditative life, through his life of prayer and conversion, he arrived at that pre-Adamic innocence that allowed him to have, you know, free communication with all levels of creation, whether the elements themselves or the animals and creatures. And so I think it's lovely to know that, you know, so often we think of spirituality as being something that separates us from the earth. And certainly there have been, long times in Christianity and in various Christian denominations that have even taught that. But that's not what the original understanding was at all. The original understanding was that there is a wildness within us that can be destructive, that we have to tame, but there is also powerful wildness built into creation itself that is a holy thing in and of itself. And the more we encounter it, the more human we actually become. So in that sense, when we see something demonic or dark, using wildness to frighten us, generally you can recognize that whatever the demon is using to frighten or take somebody down with, it's usually because in its fullest flowering, it's something very virtuous and very beautiful. And so, as one of the great philosophers, I can't remember which, said, the devil, the dark, the evil, whatever you want to call it, does not have one original thought, but only corrupts what exists. And so the more we attend to the beauty of nature, the more we attend to actually minding nature properly, then the more we're actually following in the path, the original path that was laid out for humanity, which in our tradition we would say began with Adam, whose very name means the gardener, the steward, So, yeah, I think there's something to look at within the theory that you have put forward and others with you, that, Bigfoot is getting wilder all the time. Like, the aliens are always coming but never arrive, and the fairies are always leaving but never go. And, they bring us into this liminal space where we're promised transformation and change. But that's about whether we actually activate that potential within us to change, I think, to communicate better, to have a truce with the wild. And there's no better time to talk about this than Christmas, because, as we've talked about over many years, it's one of the wildest and most liminal times there are. And I don't just mean the office Christmas party, I mean, it's so important for people to recognize what's actually going on. And you can start from the very earthly, natural idea of the winter solstice and, the moment when darkness slowly turns over to growing light and all of that, and everything that happens at the natural cycles. And you can talk about Yule and you can talk about Christmas and all of those things. But in the end, I think we're given these liminal times. And it is, for us, it's a season that begins with, the ancestors of October, November, and then right down into the dark days of December, where we tell the ghost stories and the horror stories and all of that as we kind of huddle around the fire and worry about the big bad wolf that's out there in whatever shape it is. But then we trust that the light returns. And when the light returns, there is this understanding that we're being invited back out again, like out of the cave, out of the house, out of the monastery, whatever it might be, to engage with that beautiful world out there. And I really do wonder if the rise in at least the archetype of the dogman or the more savage Bigfoot or whatever it is actually really either a message from nature saying, I'm going to have to frighten you back into being awake again to what's out here, or simply we have lost so much touch with it that we are giving it our fears and it's responding in return.
So that was one of my questions I was going to ask you. Is it, in Where the Footprints End and other places, I've called Christmas the time of the wild men due to so many wild man associations with this time of year.
It's everywhere. Yeah. Everywhere. Yeah.
Does it come down to what you just said? You think that's why the wild man is associated, or is it St. Nicholas?
It's a combination. I think it's a combination. These things dance with each other. They form new myths and new stories as people meet. It's like Nebuchadnezzar, possibly being Lycon, and Lycon possibly being Nebuchadnezzar. There is a fusion of all of these things. And there's a wonderful scholar at the moment. I'm not sure if many of your listeners are aware of him, a gentleman called Martin Shaw. And he has written a beautiful book. If I could recommend any book for Christmas for the Strange Familiar Libraries, apart from your own books, of course, I'd recommend a book that he has written called Courting the Wild Twin. And he goes into quite a number of very ancient fairy tales, European fairy tales, that all begin the same way, which is somebody, finds that they cannot conceive a child, or they're finding it very difficult to have a child. And they go to the witch, the fairy, the wise woman, whoever it might be, the wizard in the woods, whatever, the kind of figure of transformation, the liminal figure of magic. And they want a child. And they're told that they must accept, if they're going to do this, then they must go through this particular trial. And usually the trial is they have to go out into the woods and make love, or they have to go to the stable and make love, or, you know, they have to smear themselves in mud or dung or whatever it might be. But there's this thing of throwing off civilization and having to go to the wild in some way. And the woman becomes pregnant, and she conceives always 2 children. And the twins are born, and one of them is the most beautiful child you ever saw, and one of them is monstrous. And what they do immediately is cast away the monstrous child. So the monstrous child is thrown out into the forest, or given to the witch, or, you know, in some way a knight or a soldier is told, take them out into the woods and dump them somewhere, whatever, or they're hidden in the tower, you know, never to be seen. And generally what happens is the beautiful child grows up, and everybody loves the beautiful child, and the child is successful and has all the gifts and all the rest of it. And at some point, something happens. Either a terrible sickness overcomes, or a plague enters, or, you know, the monster appears at the gate, you know, the danger appears. And nobody can solve this, you know, and the kingdom is falling apart. And of course, the wise woman turns back up. The wizard walks back in. You know, they go on pilgrimage to the monk, or whatever it might be. And the answer they receive is, where is the other child? And so they're terrified to seek. They have to go and, you know, send the knights or send the soldiers, whatever, to seek the child. And the child is now living out in the woods and has been raised by the animals, or has become totally bestial, or whatever it might be. But there's this wonderful moment in all of these stories where there is the reunion of the 2 children. And it's in the reunion of the 2 children that the universe is balanced again. Healing comes, the plague abates, the monsters disappear. And what's beautiful is that in most of these stories, the beautiful child is not repulsed by the monster, but actually feels, here's the thing I've been missing. Here's the piece of me I've been missing. And Shaw goes on to talk about this, you know, from a psychological point of view as, you know, where's your wild twin? Where's the piece you have put away from you, are ashamed of, the story that you've left behind, or whatever? And says, really, we never achieve wholeness or even holiness unless we welcome back the wild twin. It's a powerful, powerful book, and I would recommend it to anybody.
Oh, yeah.
But what I think is really important is, as a society, we have cast away the wild twin. We have cast away the creature of magic, the wonder, the enchantment, whatever. And taking your point, the stories don't say that because we've cast them away, we have lost enchantment. What they say is we can't see the enchantment anymore. We walk through the world, and it's a world of rules where everything is perfect and beautiful and wonderful. But underneath, there's the disquiet. Underneath, the energies, that the wild energies are there. Underneath, the spiritual balance isn't present. And so we need the wisdom person, the elder, the medicine person, the monk, whatever it might be, to be able to help us balance that again. And that usually means liberating the wild. Now, it doesn't mean becoming savage. It means that the 2 sides of us must be in balance, head and heart, if you like.
Yeah.
And this leads us right the way back to the saints again, because there are a number of saints. We've had the dog-headed saints, but we also have saints, I think, that you've talked about before, who are the saints who are beheaded and then carry their own heads.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we did a flower path on that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Good old St. Denis, etc. And if you like, alchemically or mystically, while the story is, you know, the saint is martyred, the head falls off, and the saint either picks up their head, which continues to preach, or they walk a particular pilgrimage, you know, and they choose the place of their dying, or whatever it might be. But from a mystical point of view, that is seen as the head descending into the heart. So the saint carries their head at heart height. And they preach the deepest wisdom of all when the head is in the heart. So it's a wonderful image. And again, it's not saying, like, we never say these stories didn't happen.
Right.
What we say is these stories did happen, and they were mythopoeic stories where the word, the logos, is speaking through these events and giving us archetypes that speak to us. And this goes back to good Saint Nick and his wild brethren, Krampus and Belsnickel and all of these, and compliments on the extraordinary paintings. I'm absolutely loving every one of them as they're turning up.
Oh.
The Belsnickel one was actually so eerie. I kind of went, oh, when I opened it, it was like, oh yeah, because there is an Irish darker version of one of the good people they're often known as the twig people or the branch people. And they appear as a pile of kind of torn twigs that then suddenly get up and run away.
Oh.
And and are meant to carry great fear with them. So that your Belsnickel painting obviously pulled up an ancestral memory in me when I glanced at it first. But yeah, I think it's fascinating to think about the fact that we talk about the saint and the wild man are present at one and the same time and are actually partners in this balancing of virtue over vice and the reward for virtue and the punishment of vice. And it's like the two of them have come together. So, with Santa Claus in charge, the Krampus and the Belsnickel, etc., fulfill a function. So they're like the wild twin of Santa Claus. He has brought the two sides back together again and allowed this kind of Christmas union of both saint and wild man together.
There's a book that calls St. Nicholas the last of the wild men.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. Well, it's Santa Claus, rather, the last of the wild men. So I think, we're taking that aspect of St. Nicholas, I believe. And
I think what's really interesting is that the fact that, the Fortean Times did I think they even did a book on it at one stage some years ago. They certainly did a collection of, just like you've got the Bigfoot sightings and the Sasquatch sightings, they have Santa Claus sightings. And the guy who was writing it, I remember him saying in his introduction to it was, I'd rather be writing about Sasquatch and Bigfoot. But if we're going to be honest about, from a Fortean point of view, we have to admit people are seeing Santa, which I thought was beautiful.
I have a fabulous story of, it's Strange Familiars regular who has a Santa Claus sighting that is amazing. And I'm trying to get him to share it. And I won't tell his story because he's sort of wants to govern his own stories and where they appear. He may be coming on this year to tell his Santa Claus story. I hope he does. So it's an amazing story.
Well, I mean, personally, I had a kind of what we would call a visio intellectus, an intellectual experience of the presence of Saint Nicholas. And that was profound and has stayed with me to this day. And it became a poem that I put out on Saint Nicholas Day every year. But it was very definitively a presence of Saint Nicholas. But in the midst of the experience, he called himself Santa Claus, which was a lovely gift. And again, as Saint Nicholas of Myra, as the originating figure, the originating life, there's a beautiful fact that to this day, his relics, wherever they are, they've been distributed in various places. They're still mostly in Turkey, but they continue to produce healing oil and miraculous oil to this day. And visions of Saint Nicholas are common. So, yeah. But I think it's interesting that, again, the co-creation or the projection or whatever it might be, that certainly there are times where people, as I say, the 14 Times collected a book worth of them, where people have said, like, I would prefer to be saying to you, I've seen a ghost than I've seen Santa Claus, but I need to tell you I saw Santa Claus. And many of them, these were adult encounters. It wasn't, kind of children maybe convincing themselves,
right?
As many children do, But yeah, it's a thing, and I think it's something that goes along with the idea of even writers meeting their creations, and the idea that any idea we actually have, that an idea is a spiritual thing by itself. And I think if you've enough people feeding into it, there may be some kind of tulpic quality to an idea.
Do you have a particular favorite Christmas story, film, book, anything like that to recommend for the season?
So, well, I read the Christmas Carol every year.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want a really good, funny kind of Christmas book, I would always recommend Terry Pratchett's The Hogfather, which in a very gentle way kind of pokes fun at some of the kind of Christmassy end of things. But he creates a whole Christmas wild man in his fictional world called the Hogfather, who is a cross between a wild boar and Santa Claus. So have a go at that one. But if you're looking for a really solid, strange, familiar-esque, kind of creepy story, even though it's, and you often find this, the very stories that are marketed for children are very often the ones that adults kind of remember forever when they read them. I would really encourage anybody out there to read The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. It's an incredible story, and one that I go back to pretty much every year. It won the Newbery Medal for fiction, but it's based on about 12 days in the life of an 11-year-old boy who suddenly discovers he's at the very center of a struggle between good and evil right around the solstice. So it moves from Solstice Eve to Christmas Day, and with all of the various traditions included. I mean, you've got everything from the Wild Hunt to Herne to the Arthurian legend to the idea of what happens when we really wake up and begin to be aware of what's going on. There are time slips, there are the old elemental Welsh magic is present within it. You name it, it's in there. And she knows her folklore well and weaves a beautiful story. It's part of a 7-volume series, but it can be read completely on its own. So that's called The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. And I'd encourage it for any of your listeners who are kind of like 10 and up to have a go at it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for coming on Strange Familiars for another Christmas episode.
It's becoming a tradition.
Yeah.
I'd miss it at this stage.
Yeah. Once again, Merry Christmas and happy forthcoming 2025 to you.
And to you and to Alison and to all of the listeners and Strange Familiar. I'm going to call it family at this stage because it kind of feels like that at this point.
500 really drove that home. Just
very much.
How much? I'm a lucky man. I really am. It's a fabulous thing.
Well, it's the old joke, isn't it? The famous golfer Seve Ballesteros was asked one time, how are you so lucky? And he said, it's amazing. The one thing I found in life is the harder I work, the luckier I am. and we know how hard you work to keep this going. And also, talk about the fact that Strange Familiars is a place where original ideas are pouring out of this and the various cross connections that you have with others within the paranormal world, and that's a really powerful thing. So thank you for creating this space where these kind of ideas and stories and people who maybe in normal life, in normal circumstances, maybe our paths wouldn't have crossed, but Strange Familiars is kind of the clearing in the woods where the paths all meet. So thank you for that.
It's literally my pleasure. Like this is a joy for me to do and to be a part of this. So.
Wonderful.
All right. Once again, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas and every blessing to everybody out there.
We should mention that Brother Richard has books. If people are looking for gifts, you can get the ebook, you can get the audiobook. I think those are kind of instant purchases. Mm-hmm. If you need something at the last minute, or sometimes, you're not seeing somebody for a while. You don't need the gift right on Christmas Day. You can get Calming the Storms. This is his new book, and that's available wherever books are sold. And we have a very Christmassy curiosity here. I saw this on the shelf.
It is, yeah.
I'm not even trying to make that pun.
Yeah, it is an elf.
It was on the shelf, and it is an elf.
But it's not an elf on the shelf.
It is not the branded elf on the shelf.
No, I have to say these guys are cooler.
I'm with you on that. This is much cooler. This is a cute little guy. Little pine cone elf from Japan. Did you say this is from the 1960s?
Yeah, they're chenille and pine cone little elves.
They're pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a great little Christmas decoration. Or just a wintertime elf. Maybe.
Yeah, he doesn't, he has a present, but he could be giving a gift to his friend at any time.
Yeah, exactly.
Old Christmas,
there you
birthday.
Go. It was a great little wintertime decoration. I'll take a photo of that. I'll put it in the show notes. And if you click on that, it'll take you to our Etsy shop where you can purchase that and other curiosities of the week, those that are left. While you're on Etsy, check out our other offerings. Got artwork there, prints and originals, including the artwork for tonight's show. My books are there. If you purchase them from us on Etsy, I'll sign them before we pack them up. Strange Familiars t-shirts, stickers, patches. Allison has photographs and other ephemera there. Check it out. Our shop name is Lost Grave. But if you type in Strange Familiars, our stuff should come up. Of course, there's always links in the show notes to the Etsy shop as well. And we are giving away the stickers. With any Etsy order, $10 or more, you get a nice big Strange Familiars sticker with the Eyes of Night design on it. While supplies last, but we do have plenty of those for right now, so no danger of running out of those anytime soon. Yeah, once more, before we go, we should mention Kaya.life. I think their website was having issues for a while, so I want to keep mentioning them a little bit. That's our nonprofit that we are hoping to support at Pine Ridge Reservation. They live right there at Pine Ridge Reservation. They're not an outside group. If you can help them out, please do. It's KIYA.life, Kaya.life. All right, I think that's it until the new year.
Oof.
I think if I do an episode next week, it'll probably come after the new year. So it might be a little late next year.
Next year. Well, it will be next year.
It will be next year.
Yeah.
Next week / next year.
We will have an episode out.
I think so.
Even if it's the two of us sitting around prattling about rambling about the end of the year.
Yeah. Got a lot of big stuff coming up, so maybe I can drop some hints on that and maybe even play some audio for people. So we'll see. A lot of big plans for 2025. All right, thanks for listening, everybody. Once again, happy holidays, whatever winter holiday you celebrate. Hope you have a great one. Happy New Year to everyone. We'll be back soon with more Strange Familiars. Strange Familiars is a production of Dark Holler Arts. Intro and background music is by Stone Breath. If you want to hear more or purchase music, you can go to stonebreath.bandcamp.com. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/strangefamiliars. We're on Instagram @strangefamiliars, one word, no underscore. Please give us a follow there. For Strange Familiars merch, it's strangefamiliars.com/merch. And you can find us all the time at strangefamiliars.com. The saints curse the burden of my clan. I wear the beast skin and gave up the form of man. I gave up the form of man. I walk the high hills and forests so deep. Hear my howling, I mourn while other men sleep. I mourn while other men sleep. And may I sip the wine as I did drink the blood, and may I break the bread as I broke flesh.
as the leaves and as deep as the sea. Who hung upon a tree, and flowers ever on for you and for me. Well, the holly bears the berry as green as the grass, and Mary bore Jesus who died on the cross. Jesus, our Saviour's to be, born in a manger, yet a king was he. Well, the holly bears the berry as black as the coal, and Mary bore Jesus who died for us all. Mary bore Jesus who hung upon a tree, and he is our king and she is our queen. Well, the holly bears the berry as blood it is red, and Mary bore Jesus who rose from the dead. He rose from the dead, our Lord evergreen, who walks hand in hand with Our Lady Mary. Christmas time will soon be over, Christmas time will soon be over, Christmas time will soon be over, and then we'll join the band. Get up, girls, let's go to the river. Get up, girls, let's go to the river. Get up, girls, let's go to the river, and then we'll join the band. Come on, girls, don't be bitter. Come on, girls, don't be bitter. Come on, girls, don't be bitter, 'cause then we'll join the band. Come on, girls, mind the fiddler. Come on, girls, mind the fiddler. Come on, girls, mind mess with me and I'll pull the trigger, then we'll join the band. Christmas time will soon be over.